Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the 28th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. You'll be aware of a slight change in the schedule. Fortunately, we've been doing these while COVID-19 has been a part of our lives. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has been affecting many of us over the last few weeks, and has meant we've had to have a last-minute change in the schedule. And so, as a result, I am going to present. And there's something quite seminal in it. When we started this up 28 sessions ago, or just over 6 months ago now, I presented work with Carl back in late March, when we had about only about in the hundreds of deaths at that point here in the UK. We're in the midst of the first wave. We're now in the midst of the second wave, and so there's something seminal about that. But nonetheless, I'm going to present some work today, some work that's quite topical again. My background is a full sports stadium, and so you'll see, if you haven't read the email with notification, you'll see why that's somewhat of Q&A. I may well not be on mute. One moment. According to the okay, so
James, we're having quite a lot of trouble with your internet connection, I think. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Most of that before was frozen, I think.
Okay. I guess we'll see how it goes. If you interrupt me and you find that I'm still badly connected.
No, it seems to have stabilized. It's fine. Now you've shared your screen, it seems to have stabilized. Sorry, carry on.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you for that. And Carl, please do keep me to order. Can you see? You can see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I'm going to try and make them full screen. I can see that there's lots of chat about my bad connection. Let's hope my connection holds up. Full screen. Is the full screen viewable?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, perfect. Well, after that, and again, please interrupt me. The connection becomes very unstable. The title of the work is Mass Outdoor Events and the Spread of a Virus, English Football and COVID-19. Previous versions of the paper were involved in airborne virus, but it's been pointed out to me that actually it's striking that it's not actually an airborne virus, and the way in which it passes from person to person. Investigating these kinds of data series, relationships and issues brings you into different fields, and we're able to learn a lot from different fields. But without wishing to take any longer on the title page, we're all more than aware of what COVID-19 is and how significant an economic shock it's been. The ways in which it's impacted on economic activity in terms of government restrictions, around the world in terms of individual decisions on things to do, and of course, folk themselves becoming becoming affected by COVID-19. We've seen all sorts of government interventions, different policies of different extents, and by and large, this has involved restricting large events. Mass gatherings appear to be an important part of the transmission of the virus, but of course, equally, mass gatherings are an important part of economic activity. It's what we do. We gather in places to do things. If it's not a reasonably sized economics conference, it's some other kind of networking type event. Mass gatherings are an important part of economic activity, undoubtedly, yet they appear to aid transmission of viruses. We haven't necessarily thought so much about this in the past because the virus that's being spread hasn't necessarily been as problematic as COVID-19 in terms of the healthcare resources that it can command. What I'm going to do in this paper is take you through some work that I've been doing with Matt Olczak and Matt Yo, looking at football matches in England with the policy relevance here, of course, being, and I've put in brackets, when can fans return, because in some cases fans have returned. In Germany there have been pilot studies, and indeed right back as soon as football returned in some smaller countries around Europe, small numbers of fans were allowed into games. But nonetheless, there's a relevance here in terms of whether fans can be allowed back into games, and this has dramatic implications, certainly in England, where there is a very extensive structure of professional football, meaning that many of these clubs rely on the income that they get through football matches taking place, people paying on the gate to watch these games. So in terms of what people have done, I'm delighted that I can refer to papers and studies that have been carried out this year and presented in the Reading Online Sport Economics seminars. Before that, though, just to set the scene a little bit, economic evidence is now beginning to emerge on a much more significant scale about the economic impact of public health emergencies, and there's a few pre-COVID references up at the top here. Keogh Brown looking at the macroeconomic impacts, and some papers here looking at the effect on tourism, as we can well imagine, given that tourism patterns have changed dramatically in the last 6 months. There's also a paper in 2016 by Jerome Ada looking at the spread of viral diseases in France, using a situation where the transport network was shut down due to strikes to get some variation. We're moving into then well, sports give when we're trying to understand things as economists. Football events, and English football in particular, gives us a huge number of mass outdoor bowling teams from around the country, regionally disaggregated, time disaggregated as well. And so moving into the sport literature, demand for sport, and of course we're aware there's lots and lots of contributions here, including from Tunde Brimo and Rob Simmons, 2008, one of many references. The further studies in the context of COVID-19 or in public health emergencies, and then the work that Carl and I looked on the effect on the Big Five leagues as COVID-19 took hold in Dominic Schreier looking at Belarus, a country that didn't league, and we can see the effect on demand. People went to games less in the effect when COVID-19 was present. People socially distanced spontaneously, if you like, given that the Belarusian government didn't take COVID-19 particularly seriously. In terms of sports events and studies that have been carried out, we have the study of Stucker et al. Looking at the NFL postseason on flu mortality, and then the two papers presented in the last few months and developed in the last few months. Ahama et al. Looking at indoor events, the NBA and the NHL, COVID-19 cases, and then Kardassi et al. Looking at the location of sports franchises in the US and influenza deaths over a very long period of time. So we're looking at things that have taken place. Essentially, as well, place football matches that took place in March and as well on the spread of the virus in April. Football in England, as I've perhaps already hinted at, is a very rich setting to study these outdoor events. There's been studies on indoor events and a little bit on the outdoor events via Cardassi et al. And Stucker. It's quite different in terms of how these events take place. In England, based across 247 laws. The closure in March was 42 before.
James, can you hear me? I guess we'll have to wait for him to come back and then just restart on the method. James, we lost you for a while. Are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I could hear you and you couldn't hear me, so it was very strange. You can hear me now, though.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the start of the method.
Yeah, you can still see my slides, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Your video is frozen. Maybe you could switch your video off. I don't know if that would help. I don't know if you
Yeah,
can
I'll
switch
do
your video off while sharing screen.
I'll soon find out. I think you can. Let's go to.
Still see the screen. We can still see the slides.
Okay, good. I'm just going back to the slides. Okay, so I got as far as here before things cut off.
You just start maybe the method again, James, from method.
Yeah, sure. Well, I haven't really got to the method, to be fair. I'm talking about the data so far. The setting is the setting is England, football matches in England, and by and large, there's about 150 football matches that take place across 247 local administrative areas. We've got about 313 in total, so that's a very wide geographical spread of the country. What makes football matches in Europe slightly different to sports events in North America is that by and large, often fans will travel to away games as well as watching their home games, and they'll travel by public transport or travel in cars to away matches. Even within a city, fans will often travel, will not necessarily drive their cars to games, but will travel by public transit as well. And at games, this isn't necessarily unique to European football compared to the North American experience, but fans will tend to group together at matches and sing and shout their encouragement to the team. So we have various aspects of various activities that have been known or been found or believed to aid the spread of COVID-19. So it's believed to spread person to person. It's not airborne, but spread person to person with an incubation period of about 2 to 14 days. And so as a result, we're following, with broad brushstrokes, the Ahama et al. Methodology of looking at events taking place in March, on the spread of the virus into April. So was the spread of COVID-19 greater in areas that had football matches in March is essentially the question that we're asking. And so very simply, we're looking at something like the following in equation 1, where we've got some measure of the spread of the virus in some area I, and we're looking at some measure of football in that area I, and then some control variables xi. So the measures of football that we look at, well, we look at the simple number of matches taking place, which we've denoted there, NI. We look at the total attendance at matches in the area. Again, some matches may be taking place in front of very few fans, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. We look at measures of capacity utilization as well, so how full were stadia. So this CKI is summing up the number of matches that had a attendance to capacity ratio of above a certain threshold. So stadia that were 50% full, 70% full, 90% full, and so on. And then to try and give a bit more of a continuous measure rather than this cutoff measure of capacity utilization, we've got this measure here where we take the square of the capacity, or the attendance to capacity ratio, and take the average over a particular region. This is the idea here being we want to try and sum up the capacity utilization across a region where there's more than one match taking place in an area, and we want to see, we want this to reflect games that were closer to being full, so closer to having A over C equal to 1, whereas ones that are A over C nearer to 0, well, obviously then the squaring will reduce that further. Our set of controls, area specific controls, we have population density, the age profile of an area, income profile of the area, ethnic breakdown, and we also look at lagged measures of the spread of the virus as well as considering the extent to which areas have a footballing pedigree, if you like. Looking at some of the data, we get data from the ONS on cases and deaths from COVID-19 and excess deaths as well. And so this is a slide that you shouldn't expect to see unless you've got a gigantic screen. The actual areas, but these are the 313 local areas that we consider across the UK, and this is the variation in the case rates, confirmed case rates. Now, of course, with all the usual caveats, that this was the pre-mass testing era in the UK, so testing wasn't particularly readily available. So there's obviously likely to be significant differences between how many cases there actually were versus the measured number of cases in a given region at a given point in time. I believe from memory that this outlying region is Barrow-in-Furness, but I'd have to go and check, and that's a small town in Cumbria that now has a football league team, but didn't at the time that this study was carried out. That's cases, and then we've got deaths. Deaths where death is on the death certificate. Sorry, where the COVID-19 is on the death certificate, and so we've got a distribution concentrated close to 0 in March, but more spread out with regions in March experiencing some quite high deaths per 100,000 people, but quite a significant range, quite a significant variation across these local areas. Then with excess deaths, slightly different distributions, slightly less concentrated distribution in March for all deaths in our local areas, and then again a higher distribution in April as the virus took further hold, and therefore there are greater deaths per 100,000 people. I want you to just flesh out a little bit more what we mean when we're looking at these measures of football activity by looking at particular areas in our database. One of the areas, the area code E08 000012, is Liverpool, which, as anyone who's familiar with the area will know, contains Liverpool Football Club and Everton Football Club. The important thing to say is that we can and therefore we do make use of the travelling that took place in around England at the time of football matches, not least because the anecdotal evidence of this particular match that took place in Liverpool, which was a game between Liverpool and the Spanish team Atletico Madrid, where there were 45,000 people at the game, and a number of those came from Madrid at the time when Madrid had a particularly high case rate also of COVID-19. But that gives you the idea there is that there's travelling taking place. And so, for example, when Liverpool hosted Bournemouth, well, of course, equally fans will have come from Bournemouth up to Liverpool to watch the game. And so what this would be Liverpool v Bournemouth would be a match counted in matches in Liverpool, but it would be a match involving this area, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, which is down on the south coast of England. So in Liverpool in March, we had Everton hosted Man United, a match with a close to 100% capacity, 39,300 out of 39,600. There's also a match involving one area of Manchester, Trafford. And then also the matches that were involving Liverpool, for whatever reason, quirk of the calendar, both Liverpool and Everton both visited Chelsea in March. Liverpool visited in the FA Cup, and were put out of the FA Cup by Chelsea, and then Everton also visited the following weekend. Both games had about 40,000 in the stadium out of 41,500, so a very full stadia. So that's a region that you might expect to see having matches taking place there, and also matches involving Liverpool. And of course, Liverpool and Everton will have visited other parts of the country in February as well. But also, it's worth saying we have quite a very rich structure of English football in the data set. And so we have the area of Buckinghamshire, which is not far from Reading. And in Buckinghamshire in March, we had these 8 matches. And you're forgiven if you don't necessarily know many of these teams: Beaconsfield Town, Marlow, Chalfont St Peter, Chesham, and Aylesbury. And you'll also see that some of these gates were fairly small. 65 people watching Beaconsfield, as many as 885 watching Slough, so almost half full, the capacity there of 2,000. And so we've got a range of capacity utilization, if you like, of stadia. And if we imagine and worry that full stadia are where the virus is more likely to transmit, these full stadia in Liverpool versus very empty grounds down here in Aylesbury, well, we're able to evaluate that with the data set that we've got. If you're wondering about how far down we go, this is Jen's super awesome guide to the English football step system, or the pyramid as it's often referred to. You'll all be normally aware of the Premier League, or the Premiership as it's sometimes referred to at the top. In the Championship, League One, League Two, these are the English Football League. The structure has been in place for over 100 years. And then below that non-league, you have the Conference, or National League as it's now called. And then it's split into North and South, National League North, National League South. And then beneath that, you've got regional leagues. This is 7th tier, and then sub-regional leagues. So the Southern League will have a North and a South version of the Southern League as well. So we get down to the 8th tier, and our data set includes all the way down to this 8th tier. And you might think, you might wonder why. Well, this gives us some sense of the richness of these social gatherings throughout England at this point in time. And indeed, some of these games, there were games that took place down at these levels that were very close to capacity. FC United and Manchester played South Shields in a 7th level game where the capacity was over 90% during this time. But here's the distribution of the percentage of capacity, or percentage here of the stadium capacity filled. See, we've got some matches, by and large, Premier League Championship matches where the stadiums are nearly full. And then we've got quite a lot, some of these matches down there with 75 people in, but also matches further up, League One, League Two as well. The capacity utilization is often around 20% or less. So then thinking about a graphical analysis of these case rates, we can have a little bit of a look at what happened relative to the number of matches taking place. We have the trajectories of cases of regions full stop, and this is the average cases in regions where certain numbers of matches took place. So regions where there are no matches is in red, and that is this line just here. And then we've got where one match took place, slightly higher. And then we've got an outlier up here, which is where 5 matches took place, and that's just one area. You can see we had 126 areas in March where there are no games, 94 where there are 1 game, 63 where there are 2 matches, 21 where there are 3, and so on. Now this is something that came out of running the regressions without any control variables, is that, and also intuitively you expect that more full stadia matter. So we looked at what were the confirmed case rate trajectories in regions where there was 1 match with more than a 90% full stadium and 2 matches with more than a 90% full stadium. And what you can see is here, this roughly speaking conforms with a glitch in the data here, such that with more matches with a more than 90% full stadia, more cases, at least graphically from a graphic inspection. The vertical bars are the number of matches that took place and the days that they took place before up to March the 14th. And so this one match here was the South Shields versus FC United Manchester match after the Premier League and Football League had been suspended for COVID-19. So that's, I was going to present the summary statistics, but I've lost the summary statistics. My apologies, I've lost the summary statistics table, which was in the presentation, has managed to disappear. As I mentioned, we include controls for the population in an area, and also we include controls for the age profile, the income breakdown, ethnic breakdown, and also we include measures of how many football league teams are in an area to get some sense of whether the areas where we're finding the number of football matches take place are simply certain kinds of areas where football teams are located, more urban areas, for example. We also get at more urban areas via the population density, given we know that COVID-19 tends to affect the elderly more than the younger, then the age profile matters. Worth caveating that again with the student populations of an area, which will therefore affect the age profile at any given point in the calendar year. Nonetheless, with all that in mind, I'll move to this slide, which contains a graphical representation of the results that we found. So what is this? This is a plot for coefficients on, going back to the method, the beta coefficient on the football coefficient, the measure of football activity and the impact of the measure of football activity on the measure of the virus. So we've got COVID-19 cases in this panel here, top left, COVID-19 cases, and then COVID-19 deaths, and then excess deaths. And then what changes across these, or top to bottom, is whether we add control variables or not. Okay, so on the top, it's just simply the regression excluding the X matrix of control variables, and then on the bottom we include those control variables, so we're controlling for the various characteristics of an area that might be consistent with a varying pattern of the incidence of COVID-19 in an area. Without controls, COVID-19 cases, you can see that first of all, this is the effect of our measure of capacity utilization, significant. Quite large, also fairly hard to interpret. Also hard to see on this plot is that the attendance, the total attendance in a region was also positive and ever so slightly significant. The number of matches, borderline significant on cases. So the more matches, the more cases, without controlling through other explanations. Then moving into the how full a stadium was, well, here we've got 10%, 20%, 30, 40, all through to 90%, where the red dots mean that the stadium was less than that amount full, and the black dots mean the stadium was more than that amount full. So in other words, this is the effect for each match with a stadium more than 90% full, without controlling for anything else. this number suggests that A, it's significant, and B, it added about 50 cases per 100,000 people in an area. So each match that was above 90% full. You can see that as we go down to more empty stadia, the effect appears to fall in size. And then when we're looking at games that were below that capacity, so matches that were less than 30% full, well, this appears to suggest that they had no effect on cases. Then the effect appears to be stronger. The same kind of pattern is there for COVID-19 deaths in April, sorry, and also on overall deaths as well. So that's the situation if we don't add any controls in. Clear effects of matches, but clearly we need to control for characteristics of these local areas. Once we do so, things do change quite significantly, to misuse the term. What we find not very much in terms of cases, or at least it's a fairly small. It's borderline significant depending on when we look at a one-tail, two-tail test. But the thing that really changes is the black dots when we're looking at the capacity of a stadium. They've very much changed, whereas the red dots tend to have moved up, if you like. They tend to have become a little bit more significant. Okay, that's in cases. Again, when we've got the all attendant issues with cases. When we move to deaths, COVID-19 deaths, the red dots are by and large significant. So I should also clarify that the little lines, quite hard to see, they are the confidence bounds. So obviously if they're both above 0, that's significant. So this says that for games with less than 70% of the stadium full, they will contribute around about 2 excess deaths per 100,000 people in the local area. So each game will contribute a significant amount to COVID-19 deaths. That's what this suggests. And these red dots are quite consistent across the range of how full the stadium is. So even fairly empty stadia, we're pretty much on the borderline of being significant and positive. And again, the coefficients are all around 2. So 2 extra deaths per 100,000 people for each match, pretty much regardless of how full the stadium was. The other thing to say, of course, is that when we're looking at the distribution of how full these stadia were, most matches were less than 70% full, as you can probably recall from that histogram. So these estimates are that bit more steady than the ones that we've got for a stadium being more than that threshold full. So we've still got a 90% full effect that looks reasonably large, but the lower bound is just below 0, so it's not necessarily, it's again borderline significant, because clearly we're interested in the coefficient being greater than 0, so it's a one-tail test rather than a two-tail test. So the standard bounds are probably a little bit smaller, but nonetheless, the consistent effect, and again the significant effect also when we move to excess deaths, adding in the controls, remains there. So with excess deaths, it's about 3 excess deaths per 100,000 people for each extra game that took place, regardless of how full the stadium was. And you can see, of course, this NO observation here is essentially all matches. So that's the count of all matches. And then this is breaking down those matches by different levels of capacity utilization. You can see that the level of capacity utilization doesn't really appear to make much difference in terms of deaths from COVID-19 or deaths overall. Then there are tables. You can present tables with some of these numbers. So these are the numbers, COVID-19 cases. So again, we saw some of these quite large numbers for the number of matches with a 90% capacity. In March, adding about 60 or so cases without any controls, but then adding in those controls in terms of cases, we see that number has fallen to about 20 and isn't significant, p-value of 0.41. In these tables, we also report the effects of games taking place in not just in the region, that's what home refers to, but these matches involving the region, so away matches. So Bournemouth's game at Liverpool, that would count as a match involving Bournemouth, whereas the Liverpool versus Bournemouth match was a match in Liverpool. Then we also look at matches in February as well. There were more matches in February because obviously it was following the usual footballing calendar at that point. We were pre-COVID in Europe at that point. And what you can see is that the effects are pretty much all over the place when we don't add in controls. But then adding in controls, things do tend to steady a little bit, and also the effects tend to be somewhat interesting, in the sense that if we look at, and again, there's an online appendix for the paper which has got many hundreds of tables looking at these different levels of capacity utilization, hence why we produced a plot to try and represent the information in a reasonably coherent manner. But when we're looking down here at the bottom of this table, this is the cases when we're controlling for these various other explanatory variables that explain the variation in COVID-19 cases. Well, these are matches with a capacity less than half full stadium. Well, that's 5 cases for matches involving in a region in March, but 10 for matches involving a region. So matches at Bournemouth, how many times Bournemouth and other teams in that region played away. So it appears to be a slightly, potentially a bigger effect for matches involving a region, perhaps reflecting that fans will take public transport, or they'll go together in groups not from the same household in private cars and private vehicles to football matches. The effects are smaller in February, so more of a distance between when the games took place, and we're measuring the virus in April. And then equally the same, just to look at the deaths. Again, this was about 2 per match, almost regardless of the capacity. So you see number of matches, 2 extra COVID-19 deaths. So excuse the typo in the title there. The table is correct. 2 extra deaths per match, and that's reflected across these different regressions down here with different capacities. 2.6 for away matches, and then smaller effects in February. And then for excess deaths, 2.7 per match, and again 2.9 for less than half full stadium. Slightly smaller effect here, although bigger for the half full stadium, and then again smaller effects in February. And just to show one of the many tables that we've produced that show the way in which the control variables affect what we're looking at. You see we start on the left hand side with the simple without controls regression. This one is cases, so it's the cumulative case rate in April, and we're looking at the number of matches with a stadium less than 30% full, so less than a third full. And you see insignificant, in fact this is one that I've chosen where it remains fairly insignificant. Actually, so it becomes insignificant again once we add in the lagged or the March rate, case rate. But as we add in control variables, population density, the proportion white, British or Northern Irish, income levels, median age, number of league clubs in an area, and then finally the March rate, we see that it remains, the effect remains or becomes, sorry, larger. It becomes larger initially from less than 0.1 to 2.5 when we control for the population density. And then there's something to be said about the inclusion of, if you like, a lag-dependent variable in the final column. That's obviously very significant. But then this is an exponential variable, and there's a question of whether the extent to which the March rate is explained by football activity, and so hence whether the March rate should really be in the regression. So that's the value of looking at all of these tables in detail. So to wrap things up, this is a study of mass outdoor events and considering their effects on the spread of COVID-19, where we're making use of the rich structure of football in England, with people attending matches all around the country on a regular basis. And what we find is that football matches appear to be consistent with increased cases and deaths, and those effects appeared to remain significant after we add in various controls to explain why there might be variation in COVID-19 case rates, death rates in different parts of the country. The effects aren't constrained to matches within a region, as we saw, matches involving a region, so Bournemouth going to Liverpool or Liverpool going to Chelsea. They don't seem to be constrained to much either, although they are weaker for matches in February. The effects appear to be consistent with about 6 additional COVID-19 cases per 100,000 people, 2 additional COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 people, and 3 additional excess deaths per 100,000 people. Each match is consistent with that, and this appears to be the case regardless of how full a stadium was. All of us on this study, I guess it's a disclosure, all football fans would like to be going back to football matches at some point soon. And so it's worth saying that while this evidence appears to suggest that we shouldn't return to going to football matches anytime soon, that said, the fact that these results are consistent with any level of capacity utilization of a stadium suggests that it's caused by behavior within these matches. So while a stadium might be only 20% full, football fans will tend to congregate together, certainly the visiting fans, the away supporters, in order that they're able to make more noise, obviously that sense of community. And then, of course, football stadiums will have their concourses where people will buy refreshments and go down to more non-league levels. There'll be a clubhouse where fans will congregate and buy a drink or buy some food or something. And so there are all sorts of aspects of the football match experience which aren't central to watching those 22 men or women kicking a ball around, but may well be the places where the virus is transmitting. And as such, there have been pilots taking place. And obviously, as with all sorts of aspects of life, there are differences in the way that we're doing things now. We're changing how we move around buildings, one-way systems, and there has to be the same kind of thing. Football matches too, to avoid congregating in enclosed spaces, for example. And so we imagine that while these results suggest some caution in terms of returning wholesale to even outdoor sporting events, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it full at all. And hence there are pilots that have been taking place, and fans have been allowed to matches in different parts of Europe. They haven't really been allowed back in the UK as yet, but we imagine that, or at least without further evidence, without further research, we imagine that there's no reason why this isn't possible, provided that particular attention is paid to the areas at these events where fans will tend to congregate in significant numbers. So that's it in terms of my presentation. I will now try and unshare, exit full screen, turn my camera back on and unshare the screen, and I will invite any comments I can see. Speculation about my poor internet connection. The kids haven't got back from school yet, so it's not the kids switching on Netflix downstairs just yet. Jorge writes, as far as I read this week, there is growing scientific evidence that transmission of COVID is also airborne. May well be, Jorge, thanks for that. If you could send me a link, that'd be really helpful. Matt, yet Bauer and Furness. Carl, have you adjusted p-values for multiple testing? No, we haven't. That's a good point. 2 hands are up. The first one was Rob. So Rob, did you want to ask a question?
Hi everybody. Yeah, that was a really interesting paper, and I'm glad you've done this, putting all that data together and getting some great results. I've got 2 questions, I think. One is population density. Yeah, and I'm not sure that really sort of gets entirely at what you want to sort of locate here in terms of impacts of crowds. So what I've got in my head is that a stadium can be out of town, but still high population density. Something like Reading, for example. The stadium's quite a way out of town, close to a motorway. Is that different to the spectacular case you've noted of Liverpool, which is very much inner city, big stadium, close to large transport network, lots of people sort of passing through, that kind of thing. I'm wondering if you're able to get at that a bit more, to get at the impacts. And the second question, and maybe Dennis has got something on this as well, is the stadium design. At the lower levels that you're picking up, there's not much seating accommodation. Thinking league and below, the Slough Towns of the world and that kind of thing, a lot more standing where the fans will be huddled together a bit more. Yeah. And is that likely to spread the virus a bit more than if the crowds spread out in a bigger stadium with all seating? So those are the questions that came to me.
Great, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I think on the out of town question and the density question, I think these are, and the Reading Liverpool example throws up something else really, which is the way in which even local fans get to a game. So you can imagine that Liverpool fans, Everton fans, although David Forrest has some views on exactly how, which way around it is. Liverpool fans and Everton fans, one set always drives to the game, one set always gets public transport and walks. But at Reading, because the stadium is out of town, therefore a lot more of the way of getting to the stadium is either on buses that are ferried out from the centre, or people in their cars. So the way in which people get to the game, even to a home game, is quite different there. The one thing to say about Reading is that, of course, what we're measuring, Reading sits within its local area, which encompasses, and Matt will be able to correct me on this, the whole of Reading. So you're capturing you've got the density of the whole of Reading. And that will be compared to the density of the whole of Liverpool as well. But I think the out of town location of stadiums in terms of how the public are getting to and from the games is certainly an important point. On the stadium design, again, absolutely. My sense is this concourse effect was what immediately sprung to mind. You go behind the stand and you buy a drink on the concourse behind the stand, and that wouldn't be the case in a non-league stadium where there isn't a concourse because it's too small. But again, in non-league, there'll be a clubhouse where everybody goes in and gets their drinks. It'll be standing as well, and you'll have, obviously, as you say, have people huddled together. I think there's more work to be done there, and I think we're going to try and disentangle to some extent these kinds of effects, because you imagine, for example, the Buckinghamshire games that I highlighted will be quite different in the way that fans interact relative to the Liverpool games. But thanks, Rob. Dennis, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. One of the things that struck me was about your results. So you have an estimate of about 6 additional cases per 100,000 and 2 additional deaths. So, thinking about mortality rates of the disease, that's enormous compared to sort of the mortality rate, generally speaking. So you got to come up with some sort of a story as to what might cause that, I think. Otherwise, it's just hard to imagine why it would be the case. And similarly for the excess deaths. And so I wonder if you have something to say about that.
Top of my head, it may well be that it's it's that older generation effect, perhaps. But I couldn't spin a particularly convincing story off the top of my head. But thank you for the point. It is a good point. It's a very high ratio there. In the chat, lower levels, the whole people move around the whole stadium as well. Yeah, and the home and away fans will switch ends as well. Matt is the local area, local authority, local council area that each team is in. Any more questions and comments? Thanks for the link, Jorge. And Carl, I'd certainly agree with you on being worried about false discovery. We're doing our best to be as what's the word? Not trying to claim too much for our results. These are things of grave magnitude and potentially significant impacts on the way in which we do things. Ian.
I was wondering about the process for going back to stadiums. I don't know who makes the decision, but are you involved at all in the decision-making process for fans going back to stadiums? Are they aware of your work?
One second, Ian. Just give me a minute, please. My son has now got back from school, so he's giving me a Haribo. So I've got one good thing from them returning from school. Am I involved? No. I've had a conversation with somebody who has been involved with the UK government working group that's put together on returning fans to the games, and obviously said, well, we're interested in historical patterns alongside the pilots that they're doing. I mean, I think the reality is there's got to be some kind of a mix of both, because we're not going to return to football matches in the way that we've been to football matches 7 or 8 months ago, because I'm sure you probably know as well as I do that one big part of the football match experience is having a drink with your mates before the game, going along, that kind of sense of community and being there when your team gets the winning goal, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of ways in which you're going to share. So the answer is I don't know to what extent they're aware of it. I mean, we've had a little bit of publicity of the results since we've put them out, and a few discussions here and there that have been really helpful. For example, thinking about the nature of the transmission of the disease as well. But no, I'm not involved.
There does seem to be a sort of an increasing pressure to get football fans back into stadiums. I know don't know if you listen to TalkSport, but they have a campaign going on at the moment to get fans back into stadiums, but I'm not sure how well advised it is.
Yeah, I mean, you can see why, right? When you've got a structure as extensive as the English Football League, these are clubs down League One, League Two, who rely on, and then lower into the National League, they do rely on gate receipts to survive. Yeah. And so if there's no prospect of fans returning, it's not clear how any of these teams can complete the current season. So you can see why. And I think I'm sympathetic to it as well, not least because I want to go back to matches, but because I do think that it's a big part of us adapting to a different way of life that we now are going to be faced with over the next however long, 6-12 months, of dealing with a virus that doesn't have a vaccine. And I think part of that is going to be doing these kinds of things, but doing them in a way that avoids the ways in which the virus has previously been transmitted.
Yeah.
So despite the results, I'm sympathetic to the cause of getting fans back into stadiums.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers, Ian. Jorge.
Hi, hello. I guess it's just one question, and I think I don't know what has happened in Germany, maybe where they already have some fans, and I think in France too. But opening the stadiums has another issue. That is public transportation that will get crowded. Of course, depending on how many people you allow. But even if you allow, say, I don't know, 20% of the stadium, well, they all have to arrive at the same time. And in Europe in particular, they use public transportation a lot. So I don't know if that is an issue that can be taken into account. I don't know. I don't think for the econometric exercise, but certainly for real life and maybe assess what has happened in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. The match starts at a particular point, and fans turn up at a particular, will often turn up just before the game begins, or even a few minutes after the game has begun. I know that our example of universities, many universities, we've done this. Times of sessions have been staggered, so some sessions are beginning at 1/4 the hour, 1/2 the hour, 1:45, as well as on the hour. So obviously that's a different situation, but you can imagine that equally there, given that that's something that you can hopefully try and manage, is the point at which fans enter. Perhaps you require that fans enter at a particular point before the game. Our kids at school, they arrive and they leave at different points, staggered points, different sets of kids. So again, just managing the number of people at any given point around the school building at any given point is what matters. And so you can imagine, therefore, there'd be some transport corridor to games where you manage the number of people that are in there at any given point in time. Thanks, Jorge. Any more questions or comments? In which case, just checking the chat. George, yes, at the last minute. Research correlating COVID-19 cases with flu vaccination rates in the region. Yeah, air pollution, weather conditions. If we can get them, we'd be keen to include them. Absolutely. One of the points that was made by a couple of folk in epidemiology, biology was the connectedness of regions. And I think clearly a more urban region with a higher population density will be more connected, but equally you can, I think it's certainly the case in England that, you know, the northwest is more connected than some of the parts of the country, as is Birmingham, that may have a similar density to say Reading. So there are certainly more controls that ideally we'd like to be able to include. We clearly need them to be on that same regional disaggregation that we've got for the cases in the matches. Population density and housing density as well. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. And again, you know, if we can get hold of the data, we'll be, you know, we're very keen to include all these things. You know, and if we can reduce the results to insignificance, that's also something that, from our perspective, isn't. You know, it's not like we're hanging around on these positive, significant results because we like them. So if we can explain them away via more explanatory variables, more controls, we'll be quite pleased to do so. So I think suggestions, and we'll be trying to get hold of them. The weather conditions, Hammer et al. Used that for the US. Our initial thought was, well, England doesn't quite have the same variation in weather patterns as the US, but there are certain differences. There's always 3 or 4 degrees, 4 or 5 degrees between the north and the south. It always rains in Manchester and doesn't rain quite so often in Sheffield and other parts of the country. So there is some variation in the weather. So absolutely, thank you. Victor. No, pubs and restaurants weren't closed down until a significant time after football matches were suspended. It took the government to decide to do that. It was at least March the 16th, probably further on, when pubs were actually closed down from recollection, but it was certainly after the football matches stopped. It's a good point. What was the national lockdown situation and when did various restrictions come into place? So at the time that matches took place, fans could have gone to the pub before the match or gone to the clubhouse during the match. And what was actually one of the quirks of how the UK responded was that the Football League and the Premier League suspended before March the 14th. And on March the 14th, quite a lot of games took place, non-league games. And so those non-league games were much more packed than they would normally be had the Premier League and the Football League not suspended on March the 14th. And Matt says it was 22nd or 23rd, but you know, we need to tie down exactly when pubs and restaurants and everything else was closed down as part of the lockdown. Thank you. Well, what I will do then is I will close the session down and thank everybody for your comments. It's been really really valuable. Lots of really useful comments and discussion. Thank you for taking part. And what I'll do is I'll point you to next week. Next week we have Dimitris Karlis from the Athens University of Economics and Business presenting on uncertainty in competitive balance, a model-based approach. That's October the 16th, so a week today, same place, same time. And I look forward to seeing many of you then. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.